How's it going, everyone? If you've seen my videos before, then you should already know that Enhancement Shaman is my favorite spec in WoW. However, as much as I do love Enhancement, I don't think that it's perfect, and so I was thinking about what exactly I would like to see change in 10.2 and beyond. I will say, not all of these ideas will be perfect, but I would love to hear your opinions on them as well as what you would personally like to see change for Enhancement in the comments below. Let's start out by talking about two talents that I currently feel like are dead or nearly dead. The first is one of my favorite enhancement spells, Fire Nova. This is currently sitting on a choice node with Hailstorm, and there's really just not much of a choice here. In basically any scenario that the game has thrown at us so far in Dragonflight, Hailstorm is just the better option whenever we are running the Elementals build, and with the Storm build, there's just better talents to take instead of putting point into this choice node. I find this a little bit ironic, just because in 10.1 Blizzard changed Fire Nova to be Flame Strike damage so it would benefit from both fire damage and physical damage modifiers, and many people thought that Fire Nova would become a part of the physical damage Mythic Plus Center build, but of course then the Stormcleave build came about and became the staple physical damage focused Mythic Plus build instead. The change to Flame Strike damage did however hugely benefit from our 4-set bonuses here, and when that is active, Fire Nova can do huge bursts of damage. But even with that, Fire Nova still isn't really run, so going forward, what would actually make this worthwhile to use? Well, I don't know if I have the answer. If we take a look at a damage comparison between Frostshock with Hailstorm stacks and Fire Nova, you can see the Fire Nova begins to surpass Frostshock's damage at around 3 targets. However, this isn't taking into account Ice Strike. Once we update the graph to show the damage boost that Ice Strike provides to Frostshock, then you can see that Fire Nova doesn't really take over in damage until 6 targets. This is of course assuming that you're using Frostshock with 10 Hailstorm stacks, however our Maelstrom weapon generation is pretty damn good in AoE, so I think it's reasonable to make this assumption. We also need to account for the fact that both Fire Nova and Ice Strike have a 15-second cooldown, and Frostshock has a 5-second cooldown, meaning that we can get a Frostshock empowered by Hailstorm stacks and Ice Strike as often as we can use Fire Nova, but because of Frostshock's shorter cooldown, we should also be able to get an extra Frostshock in, meaning we get about 2 Hailstorm empowered Frostshocks in the same time it would take to cast a single Fire Nova, which then makes Hailstorm the better option even at 5 targets. I want to quickly pause here because I did misspeak on this a little bit. If you look at sims for Fire Nova versus Hailstorm at 5 targets, they're really actually about even. Fire Nova does actually beat out Hailstorm ever so slightly. It's around a 0.8% difference if you look at Fire Nova when running Storm Flurry instead of Ice Strike. And so saying that Hailstorm does flat out beat Fire Nova at 5 targets is definitely not correct. However, I would say that these are basically equal at 5 targets. I think this gets us to the root of the issue. Fire Nova has a target cap of 6 targets and Hailstorm has a target cap of 5 targets. At 6 targets, Fire Nova will edge out Hailstorm by around 30 to 40k DPS, but in 10.2 I expect this gap to close when the Aberrus tier set is no longer used. With all that in mind, I think the problem really is that the target cap on both of these spells is just too close, and therefore they both cover the same burst AoE niche, yet Hailstorm does it infinitely better because it is still effective damage in single target. Fire Nova is really only good at exactly 6 targets, and if you look at where your time is spent in Mythic Plus dungeons so far in Dragonflight, most of it is probably spent under 6 targets, and the times that you do have 6 targets or more, then other classes with uncapped or soft capped AoE are probably going to be more effective than you with Fire Nova anyways, so you might as well just run Hailstorm and be more helpful on boss fights. There's probably several ways Blizzard could approach a fix for this, but what I would personally like to see is that Fire Nova maybe gets a little bit more base damage to make it somewhat better on low target counts, and then either increase the target cap of it or add a soft cap so that there isn't a cap on its damage, but after X amount of targets its damage is reduced. This would hopefully make it so on dungeons with frequent large pulls, or maybe just on fortified weeks in general when spending more times on mobs, we would at least consider running Fire Nova. Basically, to wrap up my thoughts on this and end my Fire Nova rant, Blizzard just needs to decide on what they want the identity of Fire Nova and Hailstorm to be, and I think looking at the target caps for these spells is the best way to move forward with that. Alright, it's time to move on. Let's talk about the other talent that I think is pretty dead at the moment, and that is Feral Lunge. Now, I'm pretty sure the PvP players are going to yell at me now and say, hey, Feral Lunge isn't dead, we run all the time. And well, yeah, you got me there. I'm a PvE player mainly, so this video is really just from a PvE perspective. Feral Lunge is a talent that I feel has been pretty dead for a while, even looking back to past expansions and now in Dragonflight. With how restrictive our talent points are on the enhancement tree, there's just no way that we can take this and not lose out on damage. The one exception to this was Razageth, where many players were dropping Wind Fairy weapon to talent into Feral Lunge and running a Howling Rune on their weapon instead. This is no longer an option though as of 10.1 because of the change to the elemental weapon talent, and honestly, this was probably for the best. Aside from the fact that I dislike that this talent is just sitting out there without ever really having an option to choose it, I just generally like having a charge ability when playing melee characters, and Blizzard is just kind of taunting me with Feral Lunge by keeping it around the talent tree, but never letting me take it. Luckily, we do have Gust of Wind, which can be useful in many of the same cases as Feral Lunge, but hey, I'm lazy and I'd rather just not worry about aiming my jump. What I'd really like to see done with this is to have it move over to the Shaman tree, because I see this as being more of a utility type of spell, and with how the Shaman tree is for enhancement right now, we can really pick and choose what we need in that tree based on the encounter that we're going into, and I think that Feral Lunge would fit right in with that idea. If it were to move over to the Shaman tree, I'm not sure how Resto and Elite Shamans would feel about it though. I would assume it wouldn't be anything that they would care about, but as long as this doesn't affect how they path to the tree, then I do think this would be a better spot for it. Let's move along to a different topic, and a topic that has been discussed quite a lot in the enhancement community for a while now. Let's talk about our defensives. Getting Ancestral Guidance back in Dragonflight has definitely made enhancement feel a bit healthier than it did in Shadowland, but I don't think our defensives are in a perfect state yet. Let's quickly go over the defensive options that we do have currently, and then there's one in particular that I want to talk about that I would like to see changes to. Our main defensive ability is Astral Shift, a 40% damage reduction on a 1.5 minute cooldown thanks to the Plains Traveler talent. We then have Ancestral Guidance, which heals us and nearby party members for 25% of the damage and healing we do over a 10-second period. This is great for self-healing, but usually you want to coordinate this with your group in order to get the maximum value from it. Even after some nerfs to this is still super strong. The only downside to it is that we do need to have uptime on whatever enemies we're facing, otherwise this is effectively useless. With healing in mind, we also have Healing Surge, however this has been hit with some nerfs throughout Dragonflight, and this is really only valuable to use when we have Maelstrom weapon stacks, but that does come at a cost of damage because we're using a GCD on this, and we also then need to rebuild our stacks afterwards. On top of that, similar to Ancestral Guidance, if you don't have uptime on enemies to build up Maelstrom weapon stacks, this really isn't going to be very effective. Earth Elemental is another defensive option, as this gives us a 15% max health boost while the elemental is alive, which means that we can have this for a maximum of 1 minute. Unfortunately, if you're Mythic Plus and the Earth Elemental takes aggro, it's likely going to die very quickly, and this max health boost is not going to last long at all. Finally, I do want to mention Spirit Wolf here. This gives us stacking damage reduction while in Ghost Wolf form up to 20%, but you do have to stay in Ghost Wolf for this, and it does fall off immediately upon leaving it. So if you do have to rely on this, you're obviously missing out on quite a bit of damage because it means you're sitting in Ghost Wolf for probably 5 or so seconds. With all these in mind, Astral Shift and Ancestral Guidance I feel like are both in a decent place. Healing Surge isn't as good as it once was. However, because this acts as a spender, it's not something that I want to frequently be using as a defensive option. Plus, because it's a heal, if you're getting one-shot by something, this isn't really going to save you anyways, so I'm more or less fine with where this is at this point. Spirit Wolf is okay, and I feel like it fits a niche where you have an encounter like Painsmith, where there's an intermission that has raid-wide damage going out, and the only thing you can do is just dodge mechanics rather than DPS. You can just sit Ghost Wolf, and this provides a lot of value. But outside of that niche, if you do have to miss out on damage and just sit in Ghost Wolf to survive, then this feels really bad. This brings us to Earth Elemental, which is the main defensive that I would like to see reworked. Having a max health increase defensive I don't think is terrible, but having this tied to a 5-minute cooldown feels pretty awful. For comparison, take a look over at warriors who also have an ability that gives a 15% max health increase, Rallying Cry. Except Rally gives the health increase to your entire party or raid, and on top of that, it's only on a 3-minute cooldown. This is where I take issue with Earth Elemental. If the 15% max health increase was on a separate ability, then its cooldown would be much shorter. But because this is tied to Earth Elemental, Blizzard has to balance the fact that reducing the cooldown of this would increase the frequency of us using the Elemental. Although I would personally argue that the Earth Elemental itself isn't overly impactful, it can be kind of an oh shit button if your tank dies in Mythic Plus, but outside of that, I don't know if people are really using it too often. What would be really cool to see though is if Earth Elemental became a choice node between Earth Elemental and a different Earth themed defensive ability. Maybe that ability is that we still summon an Earth Elemental, but this one just puts a shield on us, or maybe we get some sort of ability to put rock armor on ourselves and it increases our max health or is even a better damage reduction option at a longer cooldown. Whatever it is, I don't think we have many Earth themed abilities right now, and an Earth themed defensive ability could be really cool from a class fantasy perspective, but more importantly, it would give us a better defensive option to pair with Astral Shift than Earth Elemental currently is. Getting another ability like this might also reduce our reliance on Spirit Wolf in some cases where you just run out of defensive options and have to sit in Spirit Wolf for a few seconds. And I think that would allow that to go back to solely just its kind of niche like I mentioned earlier. Now the last thing on my wish list that will probably never happen is that I would still love to see Chain Harvest return in some way. Back in Shadowlands, this was definitely my favorite Covenant ability to use, and I thought it was always so satisfying to press because not only did it do a ton of damage, but it basically felt like I was topping off my group at the same time. Plus, I just really love the visual and sound design on this ability, so if you didn't get a chance to use it back in Shadowlands, take a quick look. And that's going to wrap up this video for today. The one other thing I thought about adding to this was some sort of rework idea for deeply rooted elements and the storm build in general, but I thought this video was already long enough and I could probably talk about that for an hour, so I'll save that for a different day. As I said before, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'd love to hear what other things you would like to see changed on Enhancement as well. Hope you enjoyed the video and have a nice day.